Okay, I was told to speak more loudly and more slowly. I can agree to the first part. I will not agree to the second. I've tried my whole life to slow down. It just doesn't happen. So, I'll do my best though. All right, in our last session, hopefully we did a successful job of giving a bird's eye view of what we mean when we say the word sin and what the concept of sin actually is. Any topic in the Orthodox Church, no matter what we say, there's always a lot more we could say. But hopefully I did an okay enough job to help you see sin in a bit of a fuller perspective from what's hopefully the God-revealed perspective of the church. And if you have a bit of a fuller view of what sin is, then you start to understand a little bit more about what healing is automatically. You start to understand healing in a new, fuller way. And so what we want to do here is talk about how to address that sin and move towards healing. But more than this, I want to talk about how to address sin well, meaning effectively, in a way that actually engages the spiritual life such that it removes burden rather than adding to burden. I've already gave you a couple mantras that my parish hears all the time. One of the ones that I also use is don't add burden to burden. A lot of times the spiritual life becomes for us just one more thing to do in life, and let's be honest, one more thing to fail in. And so the spiritual life becomes a greater burden to our lives. And that's not the way it should be. The spiritual life is meant to be a refuge from the burden of life. And if we're living it well, that's what it will be. You know, and this is, we'll talk at the end today about prayer, but this is one of the things we need to understand about prayer, is that when you look at prayer as just one more thing on the list, then that's all it's going to be for you. But if you view it as a refuge from the stress and the anxieties and the difficulties of the day, well, prayer starts to become that for you. And a lot of times, because we get into our own heads, it's very common. You know, when people, the spiritual life is always like this, it's always going in waves. And when people are at a low point and they kind of fall away from their normal spiritual practices, the spiritual life then kind of gets built up in the mind. You start to think, my goodness, the fasting, the prayers, the church attendance, the scripture reading, it just all feels like too much for me. I can't do it all. And I often, in those moments, I give people this very simple practice. I call it the 3-day reset. The 3-day reset is I just tell them for 3 days, set down for yourself what a good, healthy, normal spiritual life would look like. And no matter what, don't let anything get in the way, just do it. And what's funny is after a while, people will start thinking about this and say, well, how is that good advice? Your advice is, I'm telling you that the spiritual life feels like such a burden for me that I just can't do anything. And your advice is just do it. And I always say, no, I tell you just do it for 3 days. Why is that a difference? Well, because if the advice is just go and do it, you think, oh, the rest of my life, and I can barely even do it one day, and now you're asking me to do it for however many years I live. But if I tell you just 3 days, what typically happens? You probably know. Usually by day 2, what realization does this person have? This isn't so hard. I built this up in my mind. I thought it was the most difficult thing in the world. And not only is it not as hard as I made it out to be, but actually it makes life much more beautiful and it makes the rest of the day easier. You sandwich your day with prayer morning and evening. Oh, more time in the morning, more time in the evening. But then you do it and you go, the rest of the day is lighter, more beautiful. And suddenly the spiritual life is not a burden. So don't add burden to burden. Don't let the spiritual life be extra burden on you. Let it be a lightness that actually frees you from the burden of life. But that means that you have to have a proper mindset. So what is that proper mindset? And that's what I want to talk about here. Why not just tell you how to heal? Because you know how to heal. If you're here, if you've been here for any more than just a couple services, you know how to heal. You live the life of the church. I heard a priest once say that that's a very dismissive answer when you tell somebody what they need to do is just live the life of the church. And I don't take it as dismissive whatsoever. It's actually the answer to most of life's problems. Live the life of the church. Live how Christ calls you to live, and you're going to find that everything kind of settles. And the things that don't settle, you're able to be much more peaceful in. Storms of life are going to come. Again, you're going to struggle no matter what, but struggle well. You struggle with Christ, struggle with prayer, fasting, come to church, receive the holy mysteries, especially confession and communion, and if you are engaged, consciously engaged with Christ, most of life becomes much more manageable. Live the life of the church. It's not bad advice. Living the life of the church means that the efforts of God and the efforts of man meet. This is this is what Orthodoxy calls syncretism. There's a nature of a godly life in which we are making efforts towards God and God is making efforts towards us. And the efforts that we make towards God, no, we're not saying that this is works-based salvation. A lot of people immediately, they kind of flare up and they go, are you saying that we save ourselves? No. But Christ is constantly working towards me. But what did we just describe in the last lecture? My heart is closed off. So I need to get to work to open my heart so I can actually receive his saving grace. It's not my works that save me. It's my works that prepare my heart to receive the salvation that he's always giving. And if we're doing that well, that's the efforts of man and the efforts of God meeting, and that's what we call salvation in the Orthodox Church, essentially. So we know that. The problem is that as much as we want to live the life of the church well, we often find that we're just not very good at it. And a lot of times that not being very good at it has less to do with the practicalities and more to do with mindset. Mindset really changes a lot of things. And you know this from secular life. Mindset can change everything, right? So, like, one of my favorite movies is a nice pious movie called Braveheart. You know, what happens at Braveheart with the first there's two big battles that happen. And what happens in the first one? All the men are looking at the army standing across the field from them, and they're like, there's way more of them than they are of us. They have better armor, they have better weapons, they're better trained. We're going home. And Mel Gibson as William Wallace rides out on his horse and he gives that famous speech. Would you be willing to give all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back to this battlefield and tell them, you may take our lives, but you'll never take our freedom? And everyone's cheering. And they're ready to fight. And they win. What changed? What changed? Just mindset. Nothing about their numbers, their armor, their training, their weapons. Nothing changed. You see the same thing in sports movies, right? Right? First half is done. The team is downcast, and the coach gives this rousing speech. And the speech is so great that they're ready to go. They're going to go conquer the world. And they go and they win. Why? What changed? Mindset. Mindset. It really changes everything. And so when our mindset shifts from defeatism to courage and confidence in the spiritual life, nothing about our particular situation may change, but the challenge suddenly seems manageable. And more than being manageable, it seems conquerable. And more than being conquerable, it actually seems exciting and joyful. And suddenly you engage with that battle with a new spirit and a new zeal. And you're actually happy that the battle's there. All just because you changed the way that you look at it. So this is why dealing with the ego is so necessary. Remember what we said about pride and egoism. The idea of pride and egoism is not that we're great, but it's that we're something at all. That I really matter in this. Well, here's a little question for you. In your spiritual life, when you falter, who got in the way? You. It's always us. St. John Chrysostom has this treatise. It's really beautiful. If you've never read it, you should read it. It's called, the title is the whole thing. The whole thing is just a defense of the title. And the title is, Nobody can harm the man that does not harm himself. Nobody can harm the man that does not harm himself. Meaning that there's nothing that you can endure in life that if you endure well, you won't end up better or at least preserved in the midst of it. If you're harmed, there's probably some reason for it. It doesn't mean that life won't seek to harm you, but look at the saints and look at the martyrs. They took the harm the world wanted to bring and made it glorification. They turned their own torture and murders into icons that we then venerate in their honor because they're still alive with Christ, and we look at that as a victory. I mean, that's all of Christianity, by the way. We're going to kill Christ on the cross. We're going to kill God in the worst way possible, and then he's going to hold up his torture and killing device, the cross, and say, wear this around your necks as a victory sign. That's what Christianity is it flips everything upside down. If we have the right mindset, then we take difficulties of life and turn them into glories. The only one who can stop you from that ultimately is you. And so this is why humility is great, because if there is no you, there's nobody to get in the way. Most of the spiritual life is simply that. Get out of your own way. Get out of your own head. That's why I said sin complicates things. We'll talk about that in a minute. Sin makes us ask a lot of questions that don't need to be asked. But a good mindset causes us to say, there's work that needs to be done out of love for Christ. I'm just going to go do it. And I'm not going to sit there and debate with myself about it. We get into a lot of debates with ourselves about the spiritual life. I've never thought myself into righteousness, but I've thought myself into unrighteousness a lot of times. So I'm not telling you don't think at all. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I'm suggesting that if you have the right mindset, a lot of the thinking that you do, you'll realize is pretty unnecessary. And there's just a few questions that you can ask yourself that will direct every aspect of your life in a healthy way. So, let's look back at those three issues that we said we have with that really cause sin. And let's examine how ego gets in the way rather than helps us. How having that sense of self really gets in the way. So remember the three sources that we discussed. There's self-protection, false loves, and habits. Those things are going to get us in trouble. So why don't these things actually help us? Even though they're all meant to make our life better, right? Why am I protecting myself? Because I don't want to be hurt. It's going to make my life better if I protect myself. Why do we have false loves? Because these things make my life so much better. My life is better when I have all the new technology, when I have all the new video games, when I have all the new shoes, I don't know. Habits. Changing is hard. It's easier for me just to go the way that I want to go. This is supposed to make life better. But does it actually make life better? Well, let's look at them. What's the problem with self-protection? Self-protection actually doesn't heal the wound. It avoids the healing of the wound. And so you end up learning to live with the wound rather than doing something about it. I tell people that with a lot of these wounds, there's a certain level of pain. Like you may see normal life as this and I'm living with this much pain. But if I address it, the pain is going to spike. If I actually open up that wound, then it's going to be exposed and there's a chance I'm going to get really, really hurt. And I tell them, yeah, that's true. But by addressing it, actually healing it, while that pain may initially spike, it'll start going down and eventually it'll go down below the normal level of resonance that it's always at and eventually just disappear. And they go, oh, that sounds really great. It's okay. Well, then we have to address it. We have to actually expose it first. I don't want to do that. Well, then you have to live with it. That's the choice. So self-protection means that all you're doing is holding on to this low-level resonance of pain and saying, I'm never going to deal with it. Now, if there's no ego, there's no me, there's no fear of the pain. So there's just the work to be done. Ego gets in the way. What's the problem with false loves? Well, false loves are always insufficient to fulfill us. You want to know my favorite argument against atheism? Okay, this has nothing to do with atheism, but I'm going to tell you anyway, because it relates to this. You know what my favorite argument against atheism is? Very simple argument. That man can have everything he needs in this life and be completely dissatisfied. A purely materialistic biological evolution cannot produce desires in man that run deeper than his physical needs. It doesn't work. And if you want to find really miserable people, go to where there's a lot of worldly success. I don't listen to a lot of modern music. Maybe this will shock you. I'm not a big Taylor Swift or Billie Eilish fan. But I saw an interview that Billie Eilish did. I didn't even know who this was up until recently. And I saw this interview, and she said something really fascinating. People, I'm assuming that you know who Billie Eilish is, but I don't know. She and her brother made her music, and it suddenly kind of blew up online, and she made an album, and she was I don't know, 16, 17 years old, and suddenly becomes famous for this and is selling millions of albums. And so she rose to fame very suddenly. And she did an interview where she said the dirty little secret that she discovered was that all of those artists who she looked up to, all these people in Hollywood who she was meeting, she goes, they're all miserable. Wow. Nobody's happy. No one is happy. In fact, there's a quote from, I don't know if this is a true quote, but I read a quote that's supposedly from Jim Carrey. I like that. Have you ever seen that meme of Abraham Lincoln, and it says, don't believe everything you read on the internet, Abraham Lincoln? So I don't know if Jim Carrey really said this, but supposedly what he said was, he said, I wish that everybody could be as successful as I was, be as wealthy and famous as I was, and have everything they want in life so that they could all finally realize it doesn't make you happy. I love that. So why? Well, what's happening is in the heart, you have these yearnings for divine, infinite truths. And you're trying to fill them with created, human, finite materials. Ideas, things, even ideas are created. They never actually fulfill you. Again, when I was younger, I had this profound little light bulb go on one day. I was listening to, one of my favorite songs. Some rock alternative song that I listen to now, and I'm like, that's dumb. The lyrics are stupid. It's, but at the time I thought this is everything. And one day I was listening to it and I was bored of it. And I said, why? This was a couple weeks ago, this was my favorite song. I thought I could listen to this for the rest of my life and I would never get bored of it. Why am I bored now? Why am I bored of this album, this entire album? I don't care to listen to anymore. It doesn't make any sense. Again, evolutionary, I can't figure out why that makes sense. And then this little light bulb went on and I went, oh my goodness, my heart yearns for something deeper and truer and more beautiful. Which is why Christ promises what? A living water that if you drink of, you'll never thirst again. Very significant. Very significant when he says that. What he suggests is this will fill your heart in a way where your heart will never be lacking. Modern music isn't going to fill your heart in a way where it's never lacking. It's going to fall up short. So this is the problem with these false loves is that the devil brings with them lies. And the lie is, if you just do this, if you just buy this, you're going to finally be happy. You're going to be satisfied. You just need the new iPhone. That's all you need. You just need the new iPhone, and life will be fulfilled. And you buy it, and you're precious, and you love it, and you hold it near, and after 5 minutes, they come out with a new one, and you go, nah, I need that one to be fulfilled. And the devil says, it's true. We may have been wrong about that one, but if you get this next one, you're going to feel fulfilled. I'm going to engage in this sin. I know this is going to break my relationship with Christ, but really, I'm crying out for it. I haven't had this in a while. I need it. And I'm going to be satisfied. And you engage with this sin. And for a moment, you go, I can breathe, until one breath later, and you go, oh, it didn't work. And the devil says, oh, it may not have worked that time, but it'll work this next time. And that's like our whole spiritual life, is the devil constantly bringing us things and saying, by this time you'll be satisfied. Just do it again, do it again, do it again, do it again. Eventually it's going to fulfill you. And by the way, secular society knows this. This is not some profound thing that only Christians know. Secular society knows this. You know what the proof is? We haven't had cable in a long time, but on all these sitcoms, you had some character for comedy relief. Think back to Friends. It was Joey, right? Who's like the womanizer. Loves to be with a different person every night. And usually by season 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, they come to some realization. It's time for me to go. I'm just not happy. I'm not fulfilled anymore. I want a real relationship. Well, if secular Hollywood knows that, it's ingrained in us. We know. We're not satisfied with the things of this world. But the devil's, very good at convincing us and saying, just one more time and you'll be fulfilled. Just one more time. And the hope is to get those passions, the roots so deep that by the time you realize I'm not fulfilled, you feel like there's no hope because you can't get out of your own habits and all you have is despair. And that's what the devil really wants. By the way, I say this too. This is another shocking thing. This is one of the things that I'm worried that, like, if I put online, someone's going to clip it and just leave this one sentence with no explanation and goodbye priesthood. The devil doesn't care about making you fall into sin. The devil does not care about making you fall into sin. The conqueror of sin has already come. Christ has already conquered sin. What the devil really wants is to make you fall into despair. When you sin, if you have a relationship with Christ, you recognize it and say, oh, I can feel that break. I can feel that grace has departed from me. And then you go and repent. And you look at yourself and say, that was really dumb of me to do that. And you've learned something. You've grown in humility. You've actually ended up better. But if the devil makes you fall into despair, you say, what's the point? I've fallen and I don't want to get back up again. So this is what the devil really wants, is to make you so disappointed so often for so long that you just give up. That's the real problem. And that's the problem with these false loves. The false loves constantly say this is the way to be fulfilled, and you always end up disappointed. But egoism says, but letting go is too painful. There's no me to hold on to those false loves. Okay. And what about the passions, those habits that we have? Well, the problem is that when we identify with them, we're identifying with the false self, not the true self. They stifle the true self. It's just who I am. That's just how I am. I can't change it. You've denied yourself the possibility of growth in the first place. By the way, I have never heard somebody who says that about themselves. I'm sorry that I did that. I'm sorry that I'm so backbitey. I'm sorry that I was so aggressive, but it's just who I am. I've never heard them give that excuse to other people. That person seemed like they really hurt you. That's okay. That's just who they are. They can't help it. No one ever says that. That's right. How dare they? Time for revenge. Is that going to help you? Well, it's just who I am, but it's not who they are. So it's not a very fair way of going about life anyway. But ultimately, it stifles the true self. The true self wants to come out. And the true self is one that has really divine attributes. Those things that the heart's really yearning for. So the whole point of this is, in those three areas, when egoism is leading the way, it never, ever leads to true peace of heart. And it never, ever leads to true personal flourishing. It's always a disappointment. So again, I asked that question that I ended the last one with why do we persist? Because healing is painful. Surgery requires cutting. We don't like that. St. Maximus the Confessor has this great idea. It's so helpful when I read this. It's so helpful. He says that there's an interesting relationship between pleasure and pain. And he says that if we constantly seek pleasure, while we may get instant gratification, in the long term, it leads to greater and greater pain. Okay? So you think about that with somebody who is completely gluttonous. And gluttony is not overeating, but it's just a love for food. But if you have a disordered love for food, then you do eventually start eating a bunch of junk, you get bigger, you start having health problems, and as life goes on, you're in more pain with more diseases, you have more difficulty getting around. Life is more painful because of that. Every passion is like this, by the way. And then St. Maximus says the inverse, though, is true of asceticism. Asceticism is difficult because initially we're denying ourselves something that we really want. I want sleep, but I'm going to stay up and keep vigil. I want comfort, but I'm going to do prostrations anyway. I want to watch TV, but I'd rather read a spiritual book right now. I want to stay home in bed, but I'm going to go to church. And you're denying yourself certain things. And the deeper you enter those practices, especially prayer and fasting, the more you go, this is really uncomfortable. However, what it leads to is that the egoism itself is weakened and made smaller and smaller, and suddenly the real you gets to flourish, and in the end, you end up much more joyful and peaceful. So it's one or the other. You can choose the pleasure now, which will deepen the pain and lengthen it, or you can choose the discomfort now and lead to true flourishing and peace. It's one or the other. That's what asceticism is. Asceticism, I tell people all the time, asceticism is not about what you are denying yourself, it's about what you're gaining. Don't think about fasting as what you can't eat. Fasting is about the self-denial that you're practicing in obedience to Christ so that you can acquire grace. And as you fast more, your prayer takes wing. And you start finding more spiritual pleasure in prayer. Of course, it's not just about the pleasure, but again, we're going to talk about that. So talking about this, again, let's look back to that. We read that verse from Matthew 11. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. Well, what about that? Is the spiritual life painful and difficult, or is it easy and light? Which is it? And the answer, orthodoxy loves paradoxy. The answer is yes. Yes. I was reading a text from St. Gregory of Nyssa this past week, and I added this. I added this at the last minute because I liked it so much. He gives 3 images for the process of being purified in the spiritual life. I love these so much. The first image he gives is of man in a building, and the building collapses on top of him. Man has survived, though. Okay, and this is us being piled on by our own passions and sins. And he says, Christ goes and he reaches his hand into the rubble and he pulls you out. But as you're being pulled out, what happens? You're scraping up against all the building that's fallen on top of you. You have this twisted metal, you have rock and concrete, you have all this junk, and it's really painful being pulled out. That's why, by the way, you notice in the icon of the resurrection, you notice how Christ is grabbing Adam and Eve by their wrist. Why? Well, it's the same thing I do with my little kids when we're about to cross the street. You don't hold them by the hand because they'll let go and run off. If you want a stronger grip, death has gripped onto Adam and Eve, so he is pulling them out by force. Freeing, but painful. The second image he gives is a very common patristic image, taking a metal sword and sticking it directly into fire. Because on the one hand, that fire, the fire of divinity, is becoming part of the sword, so that when you pull the sword out, it's glowing. But on the other hand, there are impurities within that metal that are being burned up. So if we want to be pure, we need to let the fire of divinity burn up the impurities within our soul. Painful, but glorious. And the third one, I'd never read this one before. Think about the idea that the way is straight and the gate is narrow. He says, man is like rope, but that rope has been thrown about in the mud, and the mud's gotten all caked on, and the way is straight and the path is narrow. There's a little hole that we got to get that rope through. And so you start threading it through, but as you thread it through, all that mud and gunk has to be scraped off. And the more you pull, the more it's being scraped off. He says that's kind of the life of the Christian. So I liked these. I thought these were really neat images and helpful to understand. Well, I got to get to the other side. Well, to get to the other side, you got to go through the small hole, which means we got to scrape off a bunch of junk. You just got to do it. The heart has been piled on with all these passions, and you want Christ to go right to the center, but to get to the center, we got to scrape off bit by bit, little by little. So, is it light and easy or difficult and arduous? Yes. But we find peace and rest in this process, and we find that even the difficulty becomes easy when you let go of what? Of yourself. When we let go of ourself, it's made a lot easier. The tighter we hold on to ourselves, the more force it takes to open that hand. That's painful. But the more we start to do it ourselves and loosen up ourselves, the easier it becomes. Healing is made less painful when we have a right mindset. And so the core of this talk is to talk about 4 foundational ideas, again, mindset. 4 foundational ideas that hopefully help us to loosen our grip a little bit and let the admitted pain of asceticism, of self-denial, become joyful and become sweet. And that's what should happen. It ultimately becomes sweet. So, foundation number one. Again, this is one that somebody's going to take a clip of, and I'm going to get into big trouble because they're not going to put the context. Don't try to be a good Orthodox Christian. Don't try to be a good Orthodox Christian. Another story time. Thank you. One of the big problems I had when I was young, so my family converted from Lutheranism, and I had a very, kind of, even though we weren't a culturally German family, we didn't speak German, it wasn't a bunch of German stuff in the household, but we still kind of had that German Lutheran mindset about things, which I have found is actually a very American mindset about things. And there were a couple mistaken beliefs that I kind of held on to that defined my entire life. The first was, if you do good, you are good, and if you do bad, you are bad. And the second was, image is everything. So, if you do good, you are good. Well, I need to make sure I'm a good little Christian Lutheran. And so I was a very good child. I was obedient, I was helpful. But there was a little problem, especially as I got older. I knew what was going on in here. And I knew what was going on in here. And those things weren't always very good. Thank you. And Christ sees all. So I went, wait a minute, if you do good, you are good. If you do bad, you are bad. I don't really think what's going on in here and here are so good. I must be bad. And I must just be defined as bad. And so my whole spiritual life was about trying to convince God to just fix me and make me good. And the second, image is everything, well, that existed because I wasn't doing a very good job of turning good. There's nothing I could seem to do about my thoughts and what was in my heart. I couldn't really fix those things. And if I did fix them, it was only for a moment, and then they came back. And so at least what I can do is I can act good enough that other people will notice, and every now and then, here I am, this little 9, 10-year-old, and I would do something good, and someone would say, oh, you are so good, you are so kind. And for a minute, I'd have that little endorphin high. I go, oh, okay, maybe I am good. And then I'd walk away and I'd go, oh, but they don't know what's going on in here, and God knows that, and I'm not good. So I lived for those little moments of relief. I thought, one of these days, I just really want to be good. We became Orthodox, but I kept this mindset. And then one day, I read in the Gospels, I probably should have been reading them a lot more, maybe that would have helped, but I read this little line where Christ looks at this rich young man and says, why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. And I went, huh? Nobody? Well, then what chance do I have? I'm in huge trouble here. I was just told there's no way to be good. And it clicked. Again, little light bulb again. The only way for me to be good is to have He who is good live inside of me. And I'm not going to convince Him by right living to do that. The purpose of the Orthodox Christian life is not to be a good Orthodox Christian. The purpose of the Orthodox Christian life is to be an empty Orthodox Christian. Fight for emptiness. Fight to get rid of the ego. I was trying to get the ego to a place where the ego looked good. I was trying to take a really ugly ego and dress it all nicely. And we were going to put it in a nice tux, and we were going to spray some cologne on it, and it was going to appear good, but the ego was still the ego, and the ego is really ugly. No, my job was to put an eviction notice on my heart and say, get out. And the ego is going to fight, and the ego is going to say, but I've lived here a long time, this place is rightly mine. And I have to declare, no, this place is rightly Christ's. Get out. And it's going to take force, and it's going to take time. But little by little, I can sweep out parts of my heart, and I can say, okay, you may have the rest of the house, but you can't have this room. And eventually, a little later, you can't have this room, and you can't have this, and eventually you push the ego out. Don't try to be a good Orthodox Christian. Seek to be an empty Orthodox Christian. It's helpful because then when you make mistakes, you don't fall into despair. I'm back to being bad. No, you're human and you made a mistake, and now it's time to get up again and recognize what part of your heart was insisting that the ego rightly belonged there, and say, okay, I need to make a plan to get that out of there. One day at a time, little by little. I'm going to make it uninhabitable for the ego. That's it. Foundation number 2. This is probably the most important one. It sounds very simple, but I want you to understand how significant this is. Live your spiritual life for Christ, not for yourself. Live it to please Christ, not yourself. Why is that important? Remember I told you about all those debates that we have within our own mind? Let's think for a moment about evening prayers, okay? I'm going to go say my evening prayers, but I'm really tired. So one of the debates in my mind is, if you go to bed now, because your phone's not going to be distraction at all, lies, you can get more sleep and then get up early and have way better prayer in the morning than you would have now. So you might as well just forget about evening prayers. Just go to bed. Or you've had a long day and you are so distracted, that prayer is just not going to be worthwhile. That prayer is probably going to be offensive to Christ. You're not going to be able to keep your mind focused. So why even try? Or, I've been thinking about cleaning out that desk for a long time. It just never seems to happen. And every time I make excuses, and I'm just going to forget about it. While it's on my mind right now, I'm going to go clean up that desk. I'm just going to do that instead. What happens when I'm living my spiritual life for Christ rather than myself? Then I say, oh man, I can think of 84 different excuses for why I shouldn't pray right now, but all I care about is what will put a smile on Christ's face, and I know that he wants to spend time with me. I'm just going to go pray. And the debate stops. When you live your spiritual life for Christ, it simplifies everything. So I told you there's just a couple questions that you can ask yourself that kind of help simplify the spiritual life. Here's what you ask yourself. What can I do, say, or think right now that would be pleasing to Christ? That's the whole of the spiritual life. That's everything. How can I put a smile on Christ's face right now? Every scenario that you're in, learn to habitually think of that. Every morning. By the way, secret to a good marriage, every morning you wake up and say, how can I put a smile on my spouse's face today? And if both people are trying to do that, you're living for each other, not for yourselves. So it makes a successful marriage. So you do the same thing spiritually. Wake up in the morning and say, today, I want to be pleasing to Christ. And I want to do so in a self-sacrificial way that is probably going to be a little bit uncomfortable. But because that's going to please Christ, when he sees how much effort I'm making, I kind of like the discomfort now. I kind of look for it. And at the end of the day, to know whether that was a successful day or not, I'm going to look and examine the day and say, did I live in a way that was pleasing to Christ today? St. Paisius, he says that there is such a thing as a good spiritual pride, and that's it. When you can look at your day and you can say, I lived for Christ today to please him. And I think I did. I wasn't perfect in it. We'll never be perfect in it. But he saw the efforts that I made. I can sleep well tonight. I can sleep well. So hopefully this starts to help you understand what humility actually is. Humility, I think it was C.S. Lewis who said, humility is not to think less of yourself, but to think of yourself less. So humility says that when you think, let me take a step back. When you think less of yourself, you just think poorly of yourself. I'm so terrible. Well, then there's a you to think badly about in the first place. If true humility is to empty yourself out, then there's no me to be disappointed in the first place. This is how you avoid despair. Despair is actually based in egoism. A lot of people think despair is the opposite of egoism. Egoism says, I'm great. Despair says, I'm horrible. No. If there's a you to be disappointed in, there's ego. So how does ego lead to despair? Because ego looks at perfection and says, that's achievable. And then when it falls short of perfection, it goes, I just can't do it. Where humility says, all there is my service towards Christ. That's all there is. All there is my efforts to please Christ. There's no me to be concerned about in the first place. So there's a story from the Desert Fathers about what humility is. I love this story. Maybe you've heard this. Forgive me if you have. I'm going to tell it anyway because I like it. This monk goes to his Abba and he says, Abba, I want to understand humility better. Teach me about humility. And so the Abba looks at the monk and he says, okay, we have the graves of the monks who used to struggle here. I want you to go to those graves tonight. And I want you to spend the entire night insulting those monks. You know, Manasseh, he just may be blessed. No understanding. He goes. So he goes to the graves and all night. You were the worst monks to ever walk the face of this earth. In fact, you weren't even monks. You were beasts in the flesh. You don't deserve to have struggled here. You don't even deserve to have been buried here. There's no way any of you earned paradise. On and on and on and on. And after an entire night of this, he goes to his Abba. Okay, I did it. I cursed them all night. What can you tell me about humility? Because, hold on. Come to me tonight. Okay, so he goes that night. He goes, tonight I want you to do the same thing, but instead of cursing them, I want you to praise them. May it be blessed. So he goes to the grave, looks at all the graves, and he says, you don't deserve to be buried here because you should be enshrined above our heads as examples. You weren't monks. You were angels in the flesh. We don't deserve to walk anywhere near you. How dare we even stand around? Your presence is so great. Your virtue is so great, astounding. We can't even touch you. We shouldn't even be able to look at you without being burned up by God for being so unworthy. You were so far beyond us. He goes to his Abba the next day. All right. I did it. He goes, great. Okay, he says, when you cursed the monks, how did they respond? Nothing. It was complete silence. He goes, oh, when you praised them, how did they respond? It's the same thing. So do the same, and you'll learn humility. Love that. So what does St. Sophrony of Essex say about humility? He says humility is to be a zero before God. To be a zero so that Christ can be everything for you. That's humility. Be a zero. There's no me to consider. There's no me to worry about. There's no me to consider whether he's comfortable or doing things well or not. There's no me even to be disappointed in. All there are my efforts towards Christ. If the efforts are good and I strive well, then I spent my time well. If they aren't, I spent my time poorly because ego must have crept itself back in there. That's all there is. Now, of course, the world's going to look at that, be a zero, and they're going to say, that's depressing. That's depressing. Well, to the world, yes, but what we're really ridding ourselves of is the false self. What's depressing is to hold on to that false self and be repeatedly disappointed day in, day out, and declare that's the real me. That's much more depressing. So I'm giving you a lot of mantras. I'm going to give you one more. Did I say this one already? I don't remember. Either way, this was one of my favorites. Memorize this one. You are not your thoughts. You are not your feelings. You are not your sin. You are not your thoughts. You are not your feelings. You are not your sin. We identify with our thoughts, our feelings, and our sin all the time, and all this is us holding on to the ego and saying, that's the real me. No. What are you really? You are your efforts towards Christ. You are your worship. Everybody worships, by the way. I don't care if you're religious or not. Everybody worships. Worship is to seek to become like the object of the one that you worship. So, I see this sometimes. I bless houses, and I see some teen's room, and let's mention Taylor Swift in the second time in a lecture, because I've never done that before. I see posters of Taylor Swift. I see the girl dressing like Taylor Swift. I see her talking like Taylor Swift. This has gone from being a fan to worship. Like it or not, we're at the point of now you want to be just like her. This is delving into worship. Most of us worship our own idea of ourselves. We have an idea of who we are, and despite the fact that every day we fall short of that, we still think that that's who we truly are, and we strive towards that, but it's a self-created idea. The reality is that if that man is made in the image of God, then we can only find ourselves in relationship to and in union with the prototype, who is Christ. We are made in his image. So I can't know myself unless I know what the real image is. It's like if I've never seen a car before, and the first time I see a car, Ford comes along and he makes the first vehicle, and I take a look at it and I examine it and I say, I'm going to make a copy. The copy's going to fall pretty short of the real thing unless I can go and really examine it closely, look at all the specs, look at the blueprint, look at everything, and copy it precisely. Until then, I've just made a facade of it. It's not going to run the same way if I can't open it up and look through the engine and realize how it works. If anything, my car is going to be a Flintstones car. It's going to have a hole in the bottom and you're just going to run and like, this is the only way it's going to work. We cannot know who in the world we are until we know him. It's the only way. It's the only way. Think about this practically, okay? We talked before about like being gossiped about, being slandered. When you don't defend yourself and you don't fight back, often there's a pain that comes along with that. And sometimes, everyone's done this thing, right? Where like for days and weeks later, you're like, I know what I should have said. And you can't stop thinking about it. I know the perfect zinger that would have worked. And you're so upset. But why? Why does it hurt? It hurts because the self is still there. But that pain is actually not a bad thing, because what it's doing is it's indicating that there's still ego there. And if you then turn it to the fire divinity can begin burning up that sword in the fire and burning off the impurities. The only way towards healing is a little bit of pain because that ego has to be pricked. So we're aware of it and we can say, okay, now that I know that you're there, get out. So don't try to be a good Orthodox Christian. Empty yourself of that falseness and fill yourself instead with grace. That's when you'll discover who you actually are. Easy to say, not so simple to do, but okay. Foundation number 3. Understand properly and embrace struggle. As I told you I was going to ruin part of this. The problem is not that you are struggling. If you think the problem is that you're struggling, then you're going to spend your entire life trying to find complete refuge from ever struggling, and you're going to fail repeatedly for the rest of your life until you die. Amen. No, I'm just kidding. It's not going to work. You're going to struggle. So ask the question, am I struggling well? Which means, am I struggling with a Christ-centered focus? The struggle can destroy me, or it can lead me closer to Christ. The analogy I always give for this is if you go to the gym. If you go to the gym and you want an easy gym experience, and you say, today I'm going to do some bicep curls. Oh, look, the 2-pounders. Congratulations, you've just spent money and wasted your time. What do you want to do? You want to pick up the 30 and 35 and maybe 40, and if you're a lot stronger than me, bigger weights. And what are you actually trying to do? You've ever seen somebody like these gym guys get out of the gym and they're like, oh, it hurts so good. Why does it hurt? What did they do? Not just stretched, they tore them. You tear your muscles. You do that willingly and you pay for it? Yeah, because then the muscle rebuilds and it rebuilds itself stronger. And as I keep tearing those muscles, I get stronger and stronger and stronger. It's the same thing spiritually. The struggle will actually strengthen you if it's rightly ordered. So don't look at struggles as problems, see them as opportunities. They're opportunities to spiritually grow. So I'll tell you another story. This lecture has more stories. Hopefully that'll keep your attention. I like stories from the life of the saints. Who knows about St. Nicholas Planas? Anybody know who he was? St. Nicholas Planas, he died, I think he reposed in like 1932 or so. He was a Greek priest of this little village in Greece. I mean, kind of like, it's shocking that he's this well-known saint to this day, because he was just very simple. He was so simple he could barely read the gospel. He was barely literate. So he'd mumble his way through the gospel. But he was incredibly holy. He was so holy that he'd be asked to fill in at different parishes, and sometimes he'd be walking there at night. We're talking about like 1920s Greece. There's no street lights. And so an angel would make a light appear in front of him and guide the way. At one point he was trying to find his way to, I think it was the Church of St. Pantaleimon, and he couldn't find it. He was very upset. I'm going to be late for services, until this young boy said, "Father, why are you crying?" I said, "I'm looking for this church, St. Pantaleimon." He goes, "I know the way. Here, come with me." And he takes him to the church. Of course, when he gets to the church, he turns around to thank the boy, and he's gone. And then he looks at the icon of St. Pantaleimon and realizes that's who led him. The St. Nicholas Planas was incredible. He would often open doors, and before walking through them, he'd take a step back and then walk through them. People said, "What are you doing?" He goes, "I'm letting my guardian angel through." And he was confused on why people couldn't see this. He thought this was normal. So St. Nicholas Planas was doing some things that the bishop wasn't thrilled about. And the bishop, didn't really understand what was happening, but the bishop called him in. He got a lot of complaints about Papa Nicholas, as they would call him. A lot of complaints. A lot of priests were very jealous, this uneducated country bumpkin priest who everyone flocks to. And so he says, Papa Nicholas, he says, I've been hearing a lot of problematic things about you lately. And Father Nicholas, he goes, it's okay. It's okay. He goes, yeah, but, people are saying this about you. He gives him some accusation. And Papa Nicholas says, it's okay. It's okay. I love them. I love them. He goes, well, Father, I don't think you understand. There are clergy complaining about you and saying these things about you. He said, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't do that. They're good men. But even if they are, it's okay. I love them. I'm not worried about it. He goes, oh, Father, I even know priests who are intentionally lying and slandering you. They're making stuff up. What are you going to say about them? It's okay. I'm sure they wouldn't do it. It's a misunderstanding. But even if they did, I love them. The bishop's getting annoyed. So, I bring up this, you love them. I bring up this, you love them. I bring up this, you love them. What if I mention the devil himself? Are you going to tell me you love him too? And St. Nicholas goes, the devil, he's the best. And the bishop looks at him, leans in. He thinks, I've got him now. And he goes, you actually love the devil, do you? And St. Nicholas says, of course. Because if it weren't for the devil and his temptations, we couldn't be saved. That's a good mindset. Every struggle is an opportunity to prove my love, to grow in my love for Christ. If the devil didn't tempt us, we would become very lazy very quickly, forget God, live our lives in simple comfort, entertainment, and pleasures, and lose our souls. But it's when problems come along that we say, I need to be like that gym guy, but in soul. I need to strengthen the soul. So, get hyped. Get excited. Get excited in the midst of temptation. When temptation comes, say, this is my chance to run to Christ even more, to pray even more, to be more fervent in my prayer. I'm never more focused in my prayer than when I have problems. When everything's going well, my mind is very distracted. But when I have problems, I'm very focused in prayer. How am I going to learn to be focused in prayer unless I'm given some temptations? We need those problems. St. Porphyrio says this about spiritual fighting. He says there's two ways you can do it. You can face the darkness and the demons and try to box them head on. But you got two big problems. Really three. Number one, you're not that good of a fighter. Our histories prove that. Number two, the demons are really good at fighting. They've been studying mankind since the beginning. And number three, when I'm facing the demons, my back is towards Christ. He says what's way better is just turn around, face Christ, and acquire more grace. Don't worry about fighting against the passions. Acquire more grace. When the light comes in, the darkness flees on its own. He gives another image that I really like of a garden. And he says, your focus is like water. If you focus on the weeds, even as you pull them, they're just going to break and grow more. But if you just focus on the flowers, the weeds will eventually wither and die on their own. Just focus on building virtues and acquiring grace. That's it. And then when you're doing that, are you still struggling? Yes. But the struggle is easier and lighter and more joyful. Okay, fourth foundation. Make sure that you understand our main work as Christians, being prayer, as an awe-filled blessing and a refuge, rather than just simply work. We already talked about it being a refuge, right? Life is difficult enough as it is. How do you loosen that burden? Go to Christ, bask in the spiritual life, and it'll make the rest of life easier. St. Theophan the Recluse says this. He says, if your prayer life is good, everything in life is good. If your prayer life is bad, everything in life is bad. The key is, though, that nothing outwardly changes. Your life is going to be the same. But inwardly, you deal with things in a very different way. An awe-filled blessing. What do I mean by this? Prayer is an awe-filled encounter. Go to prayer with a little bit of awe. So everyone's going to go pray at night, okay? You're going to go pray, and you're going to go stand before your icons, and you have to understand that in that moment, Christ is not distant. He's not vague. He's personal and near. And he, Christ, the creator, the one through whom the entire universe and all creation was made. Everything. I did in an astronomy class in my first year of college. I learned about stars that are called binaries. You know about binaries? These two stars in each other's orbits, and they just circle each other. And that some of these stars are so far away that they're just this little glimmer that you can barely see, but they're actually hundreds of thousands and sometimes a million times bigger than our own sun. And you think, boy, there was a time in history when you could look at an infant born in a manger and say, he's the one who created that. That God is going to listen to every single syllable that comes out of your mouth. Don't treat prayer flippantly. It's an awe-filled encounter. And it's a beautiful honor to be a Christian, to be in the faith that God has revealed himself in, that Christ is near. Every syllable that comes out of your mouth, he's going to listen to. It's a little bit of a shock. At the same time, prayer is a struggle. And as we said with foundation mindset number 3, don't worry that you struggle. Worry about struggling well. So if I told you that difficulties in the spiritual life are opportunities, it means that difficult prayer is good prayer, so long as you make it so. Don't get in your own way. Go into the desert. It's interesting. Christ is baptized. First thing he does, right? The Spirit drives him into the desert for what? To do battle with Satan. So I love that he goes into the desert, because the desert is this scorching hot wasteland. And a lot of times prayer feels like that, and we think if it feels that way, there must be a problem. Dirty little secret, even for priests at times, prayer is boring. That's not a problem. It's not a problem. Who's bored? The real me or the ego? The ego's bored. The ego likes to be pampered and distracted all the time. And so the ego's bored. And Christ has not showered me with grace-filled prayer at that moment. And so he's saying, stick that ego right in the desert and let that ego burn up. Pray anyway. What's the problem with good prayer, with like grace-filled prayer? When prayer, that's a good thing. It's a wonderful gift when Christ. I'm not deserving of great gifts in prayer. I'm not deserving of like prayer where I feel filled and I feel like this is a true encounter with Christ. I'm not deserving of that, but Christ gives it to me anyway. That's great. But why doesn't he give it all the time? Because what then happens to my spiritual life? Why am I praying? For my good feelings. Remember principle number 1. Live your spiritual life for Christ, not for yourself. So now when prayer becomes hard, instead of saying, this is a problem, what I say is, I'm living my spiritual life to put a smile on Christ's face. Last night when I prayed, it was a really beautiful experience, but I think that the focus was on my experience and how good it felt to me and not on Christ. Now it doesn't feel good at all, and I really don't want to pray. Now I get to really put a big, big smile on Christ's face. This is such a great opportunity. And go pray. It's a different concept. A lot of people will come to me and they'll say, Father, I'm really struggling right now. Prayer, my whole spiritual life has been really dry the past couple weeks, like never before. And I always get really excited. I go, oh, that's so great. I go, thanks a lot, Father. You're a big help. No, it's really good. It's really good because now you can prove you're doing it for Christ, not for yourself. It can't be good all the time. God forbid that it's good all the time, because we will start living for ourselves. And then what happens when we're living for ourselves? The first moment it becomes tough, we go, well, it's not good anymore. I'm not doing it. Well, now we're just completely selfish, ego-bound maniacs. Who cares? You are not your thoughts. You are not your feelings. Who cares how it feels? Can you imagine if we lived this is probably why we see such high rates of divorce. You see what happens when we live marriages like this? I was in love with you, but I don't feel in love with you anymore. So I'm going to leave. That's not love. That's self-love, masked as love. And self-love is not true love. And this is the key, is love is the transforming principle of all things. But in the Orthodox faith, we understand that love is intricately and intimately bound up with humility. No humility, no love. If I have egoism, then my love for you really seeks what I want out of it. I married my wife because I thought that she could be pleasing to me. I married her because I thought that she would clean up after me, that she would cook for me, that she would live for me. And as soon as she stops pleasing me, I'm unhappy. But if I marry to say, I want to die to myself, I don't want there to be a me to be concerned about. I just want to make her happy. In the simplest of explanations of this, when I was young, we had big Christmases. My parents didn't buy us a lot of things throughout the year, but we always had big Christmases, lots of presents. And we never had very much from my dad. We never knew what to get him. We always asked him, what do you want this year? Oh, I buy everything anything he wants, he had. He was very simple. He didn't want a lot of stuff in the first place. And I felt so bad for him. Man, everyone's getting this, huge loot for Christmas, and you're getting nothing. And he would say, no, I'm just excited to see you open your presents. That's all I want. And as a kid, of course, you think, you're nuts. As a father now, as a dad, my kids are the same way. My wife goes, I never know what to get you. If I need something, I'll get it. So she hates this, but every year I buy my own Christmas presents and then I wrap it and I put it from my wife, from my kids and stuff like that. So she's like, can I at least know what I'm getting you? Yeah, you'll find out on Christmas. So mean. But I always get what I want. It's a little bit ego there. But what my dad said was true, though. My gift is to see my kids happy. When I see the smile that I put on their faces, that is so great. It's so much better than receiving gifts as a kid. This is how we should live with Christ. True love says, I'm not worried about me. I just want to be pleasing to Christ. When I'm pleasing to Christ, I'm happy. That's what I really want. Which means the greater the love, the easier the spiritual struggle becomes. This is all towards that point. How can the spiritual life be painful and difficult and light and easy at the same time? Love. This is how we start to understand that suffering is a part of this, but it can still be a light burden. When love and humility exists, we don't even consider ourselves or the fact that it's hard, but rather we see the difficulty as more opportunity to love bigger, better, stronger, more fervently. The less we love the self, the less we love entertainment and comfort, the less distracted we are from Christ, and the more we seek Christ with courage, valiantly, even madly, even in a crazy way in the eyes of the world. The world should look at us and say, these people are nuts for Christ. But the one who truly loves Christ is indeed crazy. You see some of the asceticism that the saints endure. One of my favorite books, one of my favorite lives of a saint is one that I tell people all the time not to read. It's the book My Elder Joseph the Hesychist. The reason I tell people not to read it is I tell them until you have a really foundational understanding of asceticism, not through study but through experience, don't read this book because he comes off like an absolute nutcase. Saint Joseph the Hesychist was so brutal with himself. If he saw even the tiniest speck of sin rising up in himself, he would take his cane and beat himself to the point that the cane would break. He'd be bruised all over his body. And people look at that. It's masochistic. This is horrible. This is... No. He wasn't being masochistic. He wasn't being crazy. He loved Christ so much, he saw that little bit of sin as an obstacle to perfect love of Christ, and he didn't want to upset Christ at all. He just didn't want to sorrow Christ. It's the only thing he cared about. I just don't want to sorrow Christ. And if it takes me beating myself to keep myself from falling into that sin, I'll do it. Looks like a crazy man. One of his disciples at one point, they're doing these like prostrations, like by the hundreds and thousands, but they're right on the edge of a cliff. And one of them said to him one day, "Elder, we barely eat. We're doing all these prostrations. We stand up and we get dizzy. Aren't you afraid that one day one of us might fall off the edge and plummet into the sea and die?" And his response was, "Didn't you come here to die? Isn't that why you're here in the first place?" Love for Christ looks insane. I want that type of love, by the way. I'm not there yet. Not even close. But when we have love, it doesn't feel like that struggle. You get excited about it. You get pumped for it. The mindset has changed. I'm ready to fight. I'm ready to go in. Think about climbing a mountain. If I put a mountain in front of you and I say, go climb this mountain, it's going to take me 2-3 days to get to the peak. Why should I climb that mountain? Because I told you to. A lot of times we live the spiritual life like this. The church told me to fast. Father told me to pray. That's why I'm doing it. For really bad reasons. Really poor. I mean, ultimately, if the Spirit is right, they're good reasons. Christ told me to do it. I just want to be pleased to Him. But that's not what we think about. I was told to climb the mountain. But if I tell you this, if I say, there's someone who you loved so much in your life and they died 10 years ago, they've been resurrected and they're at the peak of this mountain. You're going to bound up that mountain. And you're going to do so joyfully. And the struggle is going to be there, but you're not going to think about it so much. You're not going to think about the fact that your feet are all blistered, your hands are scraped, you're gasping for air. You just really want to get up there because of love. If you think about yourself, every step is agony. If you think about the one you love, the agony kind of dissipates. There's a story that St. Paisios tells of a couple. He says this was a real story. I think it was St. Paisios. It might have been Porphyrios. I've read the story from both, but I think one got it from the other. Or maybe they were both illumined. I don't know. But either way, he tells the story of this young couple who are in love, but their family won't allow them to be together. And so every night, they would sneak out of their windows and run through the country hills, through forested areas. There'd be, bushes with thorns. They get all scraped up and bleeding, and they'd run. And it was such a distance that it would take them a long time. They would go and embrace, and they'd be together for 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes before they had to run back and get in bed before their family found them. And every day they would lose all this sleep because they just wanted that 5 or 10 minutes together. He says they're nuts, but they're crazy out of love for each other. Love makes you stop thinking about yourself, your rest, your comfort. You just love each other that much. When we love Christ, this is what we do. So, those 4, don't try to be a good Orthodox Christian, but rather be an empty Orthodox Christian. Live to be pleasing to Christ, not for yourself. Live your spiritual life for Christ's sake, not for your sake. Understand and embrace struggle as opportunity for growth and necessary and inescapable anyway. And make sure that prayer is an awe-filled refuge. A struggle, yes, but even in that struggle, combine it with 3, it's a beautiful struggle. It's always an awe-filled encounter. Prayer is just simply being with Christ. I tell this to my parishioners when they're really struggling. I don't tell them, go pray. I say, go be with Christ. Sometimes prayer, by the way, is completely silent. Father Roman Braga says that. He says a good practice for people is to go into a room before an icon of Christ, sit, and be utterly silent for just 1 hour. Don't let any thoughts. And he says, you will learn a lot about yourself very quickly. What you're going to learn is that your heart has a lot of things inside of it, and it also really wants to be distracted. It can be painful, but it can be beautiful. Sometimes I tell people, pray the Jesus prayer. Pray it from the depths of your soul, one time, and then sit for 5-10 minutes in silence. Just sit with it. Just be with Christ. Be with Christ. Okay, with those 4 principles, we'll wrap up this talk with some obstacles to watch out for. And there's 5 obstacles that get in the way of those 4 principles that I want you to be aware of because they're very, very common. Again, everything that I teach for the most part is just simply based on my own mistakes. And so a lot of this comes from what I did wrong for a long time. First one you're already familiar with, I've said it, but the first one is don't worry too much about how you feel. If there's no you, there's no feelings to get in the way of your efforts. If you're worried about how you feel, you're focused on yourself, not on Christ. But that feeling is not only about your efforts, it's also about how the spiritual life is feeling to you at the moment. I'm not saying if things are feeling bad or exceedingly dry for a long time, don't come talk to your priest. You should still talk to him, because there may be a problem. But in most cases, I find this is just the natural waves of the spiritual life. St. Sophrony has a great quote about this. He says, "The purpose of grace is to teach us how to act when grace has departed." In other words, you have these spiritual highs and everything's easy. Fasting, prayer, church attendance, confession, spiritual reading, all easy. And he says the whole reason that you're not going to benefit, you're not growing there. Those are 2-pound weights. But the whole purpose of that is to learn to keep doing those things when things get dry and difficult again. That's when you really grow. So the spiritual life is going to go like this. So if things get difficult, what we typically do is we assume there must be a problem. What I tell my parishioners to do is very simple. I tell them, examine your life really closely. Find out if there's something that you did do to push grace out. Maybe you did sin greatly. Maybe you fell into some action of sin that was really abhorrent to God, whether thought, word, or deed. If you examine it and you can't find anything, then humility demands that you assume I probably did it anyway and didn't even realize it, which may be worse. I mean, how I sin, thoughtlessly. So God, please, Lord, my Christ, who died not in spite of my sins, but because he saw me suffering in sins. My Lord, if I've sinned against you and caused this in my own life, please forgive me. And I'm so foolish, I'm so ignorant, I don't even notice what I did. Please forgive me. And if not, if this is just the spiritual state that I'm in, then help me to struggle well. And then you live your life. Again, if it becomes overbearing, then you go to Father. But if it's not, if it's just the normal waves of the spiritual life, I haven't felt like praying lately. Yeah? So, I didn't feel like making breakfast for my kids, but I did it anyway. I didn't feel like taking them to school, but I did it anyway. Can you imagine if we just ran our lives back? How come with like family life we don't live that way, but with God we do all the time? I'm going to be obedient to the one who created me, gave me a soul, a body, gave me all that I have when I feel like it. That's the height of ingratitude. So don't worry so much about how you feel. If something feels really off, that's when you go and talk to your priest. Father, things are feeling really off. Okay, let's talk about it. And he'll ask you some questions and maybe he'll help you decipher, and maybe not. And if he can't, it happens sometimes. And he's going to say, okay, here's the practices to do. Let's see how you feel after a week. Okay? The second this one's huge. This one's huge. Really watch out for this. Watch out for the all or nothing approach. Either I'm going to do all my prayers and all my fasting, or when I fail, I'm going to just say, what's the point? I can't even do it right. And I'm just going to give up and go the other way. Watch out for the all or nothing approach. It's a really good idea to have spiritual backup plans. And a spiritual backup plan is this. During Lent, I really want to pray for, let's say, 20 minutes a night. I'm a big believer in setting your timer for prayer rather than worrying about the number of pages or repetitions. If you're worried about the number of repetitions and you're in a rush, it's almost offensive to God. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. Oh, I did them all. Okay, now I can go off. If you set a timer, there's no point in rushing. You can actually be with Christ. So it's just my personal thing. If Father disagrees, it's fine. But I'm also a big believer that if you're going to shoot for that 20 minutes, you need to say, if I'm really, really having a long, tough day and I can barely even stand, at the very least, I'm going to do 6 minutes. I'm going to have a spiritual backup plan. I'm not going to allow that to be my norm, but I'm going to do something. My spiritual father has told me this. I have days that sometimes go for 15 hours nonstop. And I get home and I can barely keep my eyes open. And he says, at the very least, go before your icons, do a prostration, do the sign of the cross, venerate Christ, ask forgiveness for not being able to spend more time with him and not having, that thought of being with Christ isn't energizing you. We should ask forgiveness. Ask for good strength the next day. And he goes, then go to bed. Just go to bed. But do something. Just don't do nothing. The all or nothing approach is dangerous because, spoiler alert, you will never do all. You will always fall short of that. It's pride to think that you can do all in the first place. So it's actually based in what? It's based in pride. Whether you like it or not, it is. It's based in pride, the fact that you think that you can do all to begin with. It's also incredibly self-focused. There are only, this is how Father and I were talking about this morning, there are only two expectations that you are allowed to have in the spiritual life. Now the first expectation, so I say it in a different way sometimes. I use what I call a great theological term that my mom hates, and the word is suck. You're going to suck at this. But if I was not upsetting my mom, which I will try not to, I will say instead, you're going to be terrible at this. Expect it. You're going to be, stop expecting that you can do all. You're going to be terrible at this. Fine, accept it. And number two, expect that when you repent, Christ will pick you back up again. You are going to fail. When you repent, Christ will pick you back up again. Those are the only two expectations you should have in the entire spiritual life. That's it. That leads to number three on what to avoid. Do not get discouraged and fall into despair. That's what the devil really wants, which we talked about. Here's how much Christ has set this in our favor. There's the balance of righteousness versus unrighteousness, and Christ has put his own cross on the side of righteousness so that he unfairly weighs us in that favor. So much so that if the goal is humility, if it's to empty yourself, like I just said, where is the opportunity to empty yourself? Is it in victories or it is in failures? Yes. Yes. If you have a victory, you can say, it wasn't me. Glory to God. Now you've gained in humility. Congratulations. If you fail and you fall right on your face, you look up to Christ and say, I need to learn a lesson from that. Clearly, I took my eyes off of you. Please forgive me. That was dumb of me. I'm ready to get back up. Please help me up, and I want to struggle better. And guess what you've done? You've gained humility. You've had a victory. You can turn defeats into victories. So don't get discouraged. Somebody asked St. Silouan, the Athonite, once, what do you monks do all day? And he thought for a second. He said, we fall and get back up again. There's another saint, I couldn't remember who it was, but he says, it's the nature of demons to fall and not get back up. It's the nature of man to fall and get back up again. You're going to fall. You're going to fail. Some saints reach some level of perfection where they no longer actively sin at all. St. Porphyrios said, as long as we're in this life, though, you're always going to make little mistakes. He says, you're going to unintentionally offend people. He says, sinlessness is for the next life only. So you can expect it's going to happen. If you're surprised by your own sin, it means you lacked humility. Oh, I failed. Of course you did. 40 years old. I failed for 40 straight years, and I'm surprised now? You'd think I'd be a little used to it. Don't be surprised. So don't get discouraged. You're going to fall. Just keep getting back up. By the way, I'll tell you this one other thing. Father Thomas Hopko had a great line about this. People come all the time. I'm sure you hear this. They go to confession. They say, what's the point? I'm just going to confess the same stuff over and over and over again. Father Thomas Hopko's response was, what, do you want to confess new sins every time? You're going to go experiment with new sins? Of course. The passion's roots are deep. Those are your passions. It's going to take a long time to uproot them. If you have a major problem with cursing, and you've gone a month since your last confession, a month before that, if the last time you say, I cursed about 100 times, it'll be great if you tell me I cursed 99 times. That's actually great. Let's go for 98 next time. I do this with people all the time in counseling, by the way. I don't ask them, what can we do to get it so that you don't have this problem anymore? I always do scaling. I love to scale with them. What I mean by that is I say, okay, scale from 1 to 10. 10 being this is like the worst, I can barely live. 1 being or 0 being non-existent. Where are you? They say, I'm like at a 9, Father. And I say, okay, great. What will get you from a 9 to an 8.5? Because that's much more manageable. That's doable. And once they start thinking of that, I'm always telling my own parishioners, don't worry about whether you have perfect success in the spiritual life or not. Worry about whether you're facing the right direction. That's it. Just face the right direction. So don't get discouraged that you didn't travel 8 miles in one day. Did you travel a little partial fraction of a millimeter, you're going the right direction. Great. Let's keep doing that. Let's not mess with success. It may not be the amount of success you want, but that's because Christ wants to humble you and show you that you can't do it. My favorite homily, the "you can't do it" homily. You're going to, sorry mom, suck at this. Okay, fourth thing to watch out for. Be very, very wary of the... That sounded like Elmer Fudd. Sorry. Squirrel. Be very cautious of the word tomorrow. Tomorrow is a dangerous word. If you want to read a great little story on this, Elder, now Saint Cleopa of Romania, on Kindle, I think it's only available on Kindle. I don't know if you can buy a physical copy, but it's called, I think it's called something along the lines of How the Devil Deceives Us, or How the Devil Deceives People. I just ruined the story for you, but read it anyway. It's great. It's a conversation among demons about how best to trip up man. And the demon who wins, and his prize is to rule hell for 1 hour or 1 minute or something like that. I forget what it is. The demon who wins is the one who gives the Christians the word tomorrow. Tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll fast. Tomorrow I'll pray. Tomorrow I'll make my prostrations. Tomorrow I'll go to convent. Why is tomorrow a dangerous word? Because what happens tomorrow? There's a new tomorrow. And that's what makes you fall off the boat completely. Today is the day of salvation. How can I please Christ right now in this very moment? Maybe I am such a mess, such a horrible wreck, that there's no way I can do all my prayers and readings and prostrations and fasting, and I can't be kind to other people. But what's one little thing I can do right now? Just in this moment. What can I do right now in this moment? A great way to avoid this is a spiritual practice that I really encourage you. I have a video on this. I forget what I titled it. It doesn't matter. Write yourself a spiritual message to yourself that you read every morning. And in that spiritual message, you want to remind yourself of why this day was given to you. It was given for your repentance. Remind yourself of the typical struggles that you have every day that have become so habitual you don't even notice them anymore. Boy, I have a really big problem with cursing. I have a really big problem with thoughtless eating. I need to remind myself that these are the potential pitfalls. Remind yourself of the things that you want to work on that are not habitual for you. Today, I really want to work on whatever it is. Today, I want to find opportunities for almsgiving. I have a lot of homeless around my parish. It can be very tough because you're not dealing with homelessness. You're dealing with mental illness and drug abuse. Huge. So it becomes very frustrating when you're out picking up human defecation for the 5th time that day. So I have to remind myself, this could be an encounter with an angel. Am I going to think of that in the moment? No, but if I read it every single morning, then I go, oh, where are those opportunities to treat these people with kindness? And not just to hand $1 and walk away, but say, what's your name? Pray for them. Get to know them a little bit. Look for those opportunities that you need to remind yourself of. And then finally, on that spiritual message to yourself, give yourself some inspiring examples of people who you wish to emulate. Say, there are people who emulate these values. Who do I want to keep in mind today? And if every morning you read this, every day you give yourself purpose and essential reminders so you don't just go on autopilot. And then tomorrow doesn't even become an option. You can't read that in the morning and say, well, tomorrow I'll work on these things. Well, this is what the day is given for. And I recommend, by the way, on that, make sure that you put the goal. At the end of the day, I want to look back and say, I struggled to make this day pleasing to Christ. I want that to be the last thought I have before I go to sleep. Or I didn't, and I know what to work on tomorrow. I tell people with the spiritual message to yourself, every 6 months or so, revise it. If you have to revise it, that's good news. It means that you must have made some progress. If you don't revise it, you may need to find some more inspiring ways to tell yourself to do these things because you haven't moved yet. It's okay. Okay, finally, number 5, what to watch out for. Don't allow the world to train you in distraction. Our world trains us in distraction. It puts this practice into us. Billboards everywhere. You go to malls now, and the first time I was in Cincinnati, the first time I saw a television screen in between the elevators with commercials. And you see this at gas stations now. Because God forbid you pump your gas in peace for 30 seconds. There's noise, 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 right? How the Grinch Stole Christmas. You know what the greatest teachers of distraction are? You know what the devil's tools are in this day? It's the very thing that's recording me right now. It's literally, social media is designed to keep you distracted. Like, you go to YouTube's and now there's YouTube Shorts. YouTube Short. That one's entertaining. I'm going to watch that for 10 seconds. Okay. Well, that one's not entertaining. Go scroll. And you sit there and like 3 hours later you go, oh my goodness, where did the time go? Didn't I have things to do today? And by the time you do that, you feel so bad about yourself, you don't even want to get yourself up and going. That's why I teach my kids. I tell them every day, don't ever, ever, ever treat the spiritual life, by the way, like a checklist. Don't treat it like a checklist. It's a relationship. However, having a checklist is not a bad thing. If you treat it like a checklist, if you don't complete the whole list, you just feel miserable at yourself. But if you're living the spiritual life for Christ, not for yourself, you say, well, I didn't do all 10, but I did 5. It's better than nothing. Okay? But having a checklist is not a bad thing. So what do I tell my kids? I tell them, make a list of what you're going to do each day and find the thing that you want to do the least and do that first. Why is that a good strategy? Because you start your day with a sense of accomplishment. And you say, my goodness, I feel like I can conquer everything. That's why I like starting the day with cold showers. By the way worse here than in Salt Lake City. Your water is so much colder. Yeah. That was a shock this morning. That woke me up.
We give you 5 minutes every hour. You get hot water in our house. Whether you want it or not.
Watch out for technology. Don't train yourself in distraction. You need to train yourself to focus. Can you imagine if you sit on social media 2, 3, 4 hours a day and then you go try to pray for 20 minutes? Why do you think you can't keep your focus? You've trained yourself. So, yeah, okay, get rid of it and then be practical with how you're going to get your mind focused on Christ again. I'll share with you. I'm going to end. I've gone a little bit longer on this one because we had a lot of time, so I went a little slower. But I want to share with you one of the practices that I shared with my parish a couple months ago that a nun taught me. This nun said that her abbess told her she really needs to focus more on gratitude. And so she told her to buy one of those little metal counters. You push every time and it keeps counting. You know, like they have that in Costco every time someone walks in. And she said every day, every time you thank Christ for something, click it once. At the end of the day, look at your number and write it on the calendar. And every day try to beat your previous record. So practical. I love that. Using your phone to set a timer so that you pray and you don't sit there and just try to get through your prayers, but that's a practical thing. Writing the spiritual message yourself, practical. We need to train ourselves to be focused spiritually and be practical about it. Men who are struggling with their devices at night, I tell them, have you ever thought about not closing your door? I never thought about, or young couples who are in love and they're engaged and want to get married. Father, we want to remain pure, but we're really having a tough time. Okay, are you entering a room alone together? Yeah? Don't do that. Be practical. Be utterly practical. A lot of times we think that in the spiritual life, because we're dealing with spiritual things, we can't just be practical. No, be practical. Find little practical reminders. You know, I've had a lot of guys, like obsessed with video games. I'm okay. Just like I'm telling you, set a timer for prayer, set a timer for your video games. I never thought about that. You're playing 5 hours a day. Let's shoot for 4.5. And let's fill in that other half hour with prayer. And after a few weeks, let's get it down to 4. And then you're not going to do an hour of prayer yet, but we can tick it up by 5 minutes. We can do 35 minutes of prayer. And let's make it the goal of getting down to half an hour a day. I had a woman, by the way, once, she said the one thing she just couldn't get rid of in her life were gossip magazines. I don't know, do they still exist? Like People and Us, are they still a thing? I thought with the internet, maybe they had died. Father, do you read these things? So homily material every week, right? this woman told me, she says, I have a subscription to People. I can't get rid of it. I said, okay, you're going to do something very simple. When that magazine comes, I don't know, are they weekly? Or are they, I don't know how, but I said, for that first magazine, I want you to, before you even look at it, take the very last page, rip it out, crumple it up, and throw it away. And after a week, I want you to take the last 2 pages, rip them out, crumple it up, throw it away. Then the 3 pages, then 4 pages, then 5 pages, then 6 pages. She said, well, by the time I get to 6 pages, it's not going to be worth the subscription. I go, yep. Ding, 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 ding. Let's be very practical about this. So be a wise fighter. Don't, remember, this 5th one is don't allow the world to train you in distraction. Be a wise fighter who trains yourself in good fighting techniques. Look at your life. When you have a fall, examine it. Don't sit there and obsess over yourself. Your eyes need to be on Christ, not on yourself, but you should look at yourself enough to say, what led up to this? Because I didn't just fall into this. I didn't just do something. That's not what happened. There were things that led up to it. A lot of people, they'll find that what leads up to their particular passions and leads them away from Christ are stress and anxiety and exhaustion. They just stop thinking straight. So you go, okay, I need to find a way to point out to myself when I'm stressed, anxious, and tired, and I need to put on a spiritual message to myself, which you have in your back pocket, a good way to do it, reminders that when you're feeling this way, these are good outlets rather than bad outlets. These will make Christ a refuge rather than something you run from. Be practical in the spiritual life. I will end by saying, pray, 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 pray. Enter the desert of prayer. Be scorched. Again, another mantra. This is my last mantra for the day, I think. Do not learn to pray and fast. Learn to love prayer and to love fasting. It's a very different goal. Love prayer and fasting. The only way to do that is to get very acquainted with them and do them. And eventually you see the benefits and you realize the benefits outweigh everything that you think you're lacking, and you'll fall in love with them. And when you fall in love with them, even when there's struggles, you get excited about them. That makes you a good warrior. That makes you a good struggler. And my final piece of advice is, in order to grease the wheels of the spiritual life, my personal recommendation is always have a life of a saint that you're reading. Even just 3 pages a day. Just every day, read it, just to remind yourself, what am I shooting for? What does this look like? Even with your spiritual message to yourself, it'll help you realize what it is that you wrote in there. Always have a life of a saint. Even if you're doing other spiritual reading, I have people in my parish who would love to read theology, church history. That's all fine. But read the lives of the saints, especially the modern ones. Just a few pages a day. You can do more. You want to do 30 pages, I'm not going to tell you no. But at least do 3 pages a day. It'll help grease the wheels, and it'll help you in that victorious mindset of, oh yeah, this is what I'm aiming for. This is what real life looks like. You know, the fathers say about the saints that although they look to us extraordinary, from God's perspective on what he meant for man to be, they're actually ordinary. We're below ordinary. We just want to get to that. When we see all these great miracles, that's the way God intended for all of us to be. So, let me scroll through this and just remind you of what we talked about here, because I know I threw a lot at you. Number 1, we talked a lot about how ego is the problem. Ego really is the problem in every sense. So we need a good mindset to be able to get that ego out. We need a proper mindset. That proper mindset, I gave you 4 things to think about. Number 1, don't be a good Orthodox Christian, be an empty Orthodox Christian. Number 2, live for Christ and to please him, not for yourself. You lose yourself in the spiritual life. That's what Christ said, right? If you want to find yourself, you got to lose yourself. If you want to be great, you got to be the servant of all. Number 3, understand and embrace struggles. Don't see struggles as a problem, and don't see getting away from struggles as a goal. That's a full-hearted goal. It's not going to work. Rather, struggles are going to happen, so struggle well. And struggle excitedly. 4, prayer is an awe-filled encounter. Is it a struggle? Yes. Is it a fight? Yes. It's a lot of things, but it's also an awe-filled encounter. And if I need to be filled with grace, I need to go to the one who does that. I can't, if I do numbers 1 through 3 and do everything in the spiritual life, if I'm not acquiring greater grace by going to Christ, useless. Okay? And then we talked about 5 obstacles. Don't worry too much about how you feel. Don't take the all or nothing approach. Don't get discouraged and fall into despair. Watch out for the word tomorrow. And watch out about how the world is constantly training you in distraction. The world is not, just because it's secular doesn't mean it's not doing something. It is active. It's actively trying to distract you. Don't allow that. Pray, read the lives of the saints. Spiritual life becomes beautiful again. That's what you want. You want to recognize the beauty of the spiritual life. Okay, that went longer than I was intending, but I was trying to go longer because I was told to.
Like, great Alan.
Yes, by the boss. Questions, concerns, disagreements, fights. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, how do you train your kids to do things out of love as well? First, number one, you have to display it. You have to display it. What they see will teach them much more than what they hear. What they see is the most important thing. So let them see it. Number two, as we said, speak to God about your kids more than you speak to your kids about God. Pray for them. I will tell you, prayer really does work miracles. I've had times where my kids were engaged in behaviors that I tried every parenting strategy I could find and nothing seemed to work. And then one day I just went, hey, idiot, why don't you just try and go pray? And so I dedicated myself 45 minutes to the Jesus prayer for that child for 3 days in a row. Magically, it corrected itself. Did it really correct itself? No, but you bring grace into it. Prayer actually works. You don't want to pray with that mindset. I'm going to pray, and if it doesn't work, I'm going to stop praying. That's not the point. But it does actually work miracles. And then third, an abbess told this to my wife. She said, don't vacuum the house to keep the house clean. Again, don't take that out of context. No one clip this and say, don't vacuum the house. Father Paul's advice. No. She said, don't vacuum the house to keep the house clean. Vacuum the house out of gratitude to Christ because you have a house to vacuum in the first place. I loved that.